So let's talk about music a little bit more specifically now. Let's talk about how the elements of music were used in the new styles that were considered to be 20th century classical music and why those elements were used the way that they were used. In the 20th century, composers were inspired by the past, the present, by what was around them in the world, and by what is new, what hadn't even been created yet. I've listed here below a lot of the questions they were asking themselves about music. They were asking whether ugliness could be a part of music, whether ugly could even be considered beautiful, that riots and war, some of the most evil things to happen to humanity, could be used as inspiration for beautiful or ugly music. They asked more fundamental questions such as what is sound? Can noise be used in music? Can noise be music? Why do they organize any element of music like melody or harmony? Why not be completely random or mathematical? One of the more important questions they asked was, does the audience or listener even matter? Composers in the 20th century began to believe that music was simply music, that it didn't need a listener. Sometimes it didn't even need a composer. Why would the listener be important? For popular music, perhaps the listener was still the most important aspect of the music because a listener had to be pleased in order for music to become popular. But remember that popular and classical styles were separated in this period. They perhaps influenced each other, but classical composers of the 20th century had no care for staying popular. They wanted to rediscover the meaning of music, period. They did not want to play to an audience or try to be popular so that their music was dumbed down in any way. This was the age of choice. It was the age of unconventionality. If the listener did not matter, or at least was secondary, then why not be unconventional, exciting, extreme? Why not recreate what the idea of music really was? They still, however, had to use the elements you've learned about, such as tone color, harmony, melody, rhythm, texture. All of these elements create sound. When put together into an organized composition, they create music. But musicians and composers of this era believed there were no limitations on how these elements could be used or combined, and that was a very different viewpoint from even the individualized composers of the Romantic period. In the Romantic period, there were still characteristics that were fluid, that every certain type of music had, program music or nationalistic music. All music had elements of that in the Romantic era because they were considered important ways to combine the elements. In this period, it was entirely up to the composer whether he used these elements in the basic ways that we've learned to understand them, or in new ways, or not use them at all. For example, when we think of tone color, we think of the sounds of the different instruments, the different emotions that were evoked, especially in the Romantic period. In 20th century classical music, composers created what are called extended techniques to create sound effects. For example, on a stringed instrument, instead of bowing across the string, they would take two fingers, raise the string up as high as they could, and then release it when it was at the height of tension. It would bounce back down onto the board that the strings were placed onto and create a snapping effect. They would also require brass and wind players to scream or blow into their instrument in different ways than normal to create different noises and sounds. Tone color is also very affected by the use of percussion, and in the 20th century, not only were more percussion instruments created, but they started to use everyday objects as percussion. In a piece I've recently performed, they used brake drums from a car and tire rims as well, and they beat on those objects to create a rhythmic, powerful effect as well as a new percussive tone color. One of the other aspects that changed was before this we had the Romantic and classical orchestra. We had a group of players that were put together on stage to create one sound together. Sometimes there were solo parts, or a single instrument would be singled out so that they could create a beautiful tone color on their own. But in the 20th century, composers began to do this exclusively. They would write for unusual groupings of instruments, usually from 4 to 20 players, and they would be considered a group of soloists rather than a group of players put together to create one sound. That way, each player, as a soloist, could create different tone colors on their instruments and truly create a piece of music that expressed many different levels of color and emotion. We can also think about harmony. In the past, in classical music, there has been a balance between consonance and dissonance. Hopefully you remember that consonance is when music sounds stable, balanced, happy. It sounds like it has a conclusion, a beginning, middle, and end. Dissonance is instability in music. It's something that sounds incomplete or leaves us hanging, feeling as though there should be something that comes after it. In 20th century music, they no longer believed in the idea of balance in music. Instead, they emphasized dissonance and instability. They did this by creating different kinds of chords. Remember that chords are a group of notes, usually in thirds, so every other note on a keyboard, that are used as harmonic progressions underneath a melody to support that melody. New chords that were used in this period, that were created in this period, include the polychord, which is 2 chords in 2 different keys played at the same time, a tone cluster, which is a group of notes adjacent to each other, so literally a half step apart. It's as though you've taken your fist on a piano keyboard and you simply bang it down on a whole bunch of notes at once. That clustered sound is called a tone cluster. A quartal harmony is a chord built in fourths, not thirds. There were also quintal harmonies that were built in fifths instead of fourths or thirds. Many of these new chords created new tone colors and helped to portray different types of emotion in the music. These harmonies were used by all different varieties of 20th century composers, and composers kept creating new types of chords and new ways to combine chords to create new and interesting styles throughout the period. Remember that tonality and key were one of the other aspects that we talked about when it came to the elements of music. Tonality and key are really the sense of normalcy that we hear in music, the sense that the music has a home base, a key, a tone, and a central scale that it revolves around. In the 20th century, most composers strayed from those homes, and they developed alternative systems of tonality or key. Some of those, known as atonality, polytonality, and bitonality, were used or combined together to create new styles of music. Atonality is when you use no key at all, where all 12 notes in the music chromatic scale are used on equal footing. So when you listen to music like this, you're not really going to hear melody or harmony, you're simply going to hear random pitches. Whether the music itself is random or controlled is not in question. What you're listening to when you listen to atonal music is music that simply has no home. It doesn't feel a sense of balance or completion in any way. It simply sounds like tones and pitches put together into some sort of organized system. Eventually, atonal music came to actually be systemized and became defined as a 12-tone system, which is a mathematical approach to organizing tonality, melody, and harmony versus the normal musical scales. So in other words, instead of using a central tone, scale, and chord to create a key or tonality, all 12 pitches were used in very equal ways in an atonal piece of music, which kept the listener off balance and thinking that the music itself was unstable. Polytonality and bitonality is the use of many keys at once or 2 keys at once. This had a very strange sound and was used in many of the large genres that were created in this period. Music sounded very different depending on how far the composer strayed from a normal sense of tonality. Rhythm, one of our other basic elements, is something that has changed drastically in the last 400 years. But in the last century alone, rhythm has become so much more important because composers have really come to the idea that all aspects and elements of music can be considered the most important element. In the classical and romantic period, melody was the most important aspect. In 20th century, early 20th century music in particular, rhythm becomes the most important aspect of the music. Rhythm becomes unpredictable, completely varied and irregular. Composers choose to shift between different meters quickly, and they use unusual meters, 7/16 or 5/4, other things that are unbalanced, and they shift between these unbalanced meters often. They also use polyrhythms, which means that they're using two different rhythms at the exact same time that do not fit with each other. For example, they're in a duple meter, but they're using triplets as well as duples at the same time. Now, this is something that was used sometimes in romantic music, but again, there was no limit in the 20th century for classical composers, so they really delved into these ideas and took them as far as they could. Melody is something that changes drastically in these past 100 years when we're talking about classical music. Popular music tends to stay more similar to what we heard in the art songs or the beautiful melodies you hear from the Romantic era in those operas as well. Melody in 20th century classical music starts to question whether it needs to be beautiful or not. Does a melody have to be beautiful? Does it have to go along with its harmony? Does it have to make sense or be easy and singable? Composers answered all of these questions with a big fat no. They believed that music, and melody in particular, did not have to be beautiful and melodious. It did not have to be supported by harmony. In fact, sometimes harmony overruled or became equal to melody. And sometimes composers used no melody at all. They would use mathematical equations or rhythm as instead. There was no such thing in the early 20th century as a singable melody, something that was stepwise, something smooth and beautiful. Instead, they really tried to base melodies off of the ideas of noise, ugliness, and mathematics because they wanted to see how they could redefine melody as much as redefine music. They would use frequent, large leaps, irregular rhythms, and difficult meters, and unbalanced and tending towards complicated and ugly sounds. This is not to say that some composers of the period did not create beautiful melodies, but most had moved beyond the idea that melody was important and instead thought of melody as another tool, another way to change music at the most fundamental level so that it sounded different, interesting, creative, and innovative. These trends in the use of the element and the discovery of new definitions of music itself led to the creation of many new styles. As I've already said, we're going to discuss a few of these more interesting trends and the composers that wrote music in these styles. Some of the styles we'll be talking about include Impressionism, Primitivism, Expressionism, American art music, chance music, minimalism, and electronic mixed media music. Much of this music is really straightforward in how it's defined and how it uses the element in very specific ways, but it's strange to listen to. So if you don't quite understand it on the first listen, try it one more time before you give up and decide you don't like it. Some of this music is hard the first time you listen to, but really captivating if you listen to it a few times over. And remember as well that these words are great descriptions of the music themselves. Impression, primitive, expression, art music, chance, minimal, all of these words are easily defined words in the English language. So if you think about them and how they will relate to the sound of the music that's being created and named after them, you'll better understand the music itself. Move on now to the lectures on these forms, and I hope you enjoy listening to the music from these styles.